Picture a road outside Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. A knight from Normandy, who had never seen this city before, who had walked 2,000 miles to reach it, is kneeling on stones darkened with blood, weeping. He believes he is doing God's work. The man whose life he had just taken may have believed exactly the same thing about his own God. What happened here was not a misunderstanding. It was the product of 2 centuries of construction, political, theological, and economic, by institutions that understood parts of the power they were unleashing, even if none of them could fully control what followed. The Crusades were not born from religion alone. They emerged from a crisis of power, theology, fear, ambition, and opportunity, and they did not end when the last Crusader castle fell. They ended, if they have ended at all, somewhere in a conversation that the modern world is still having. This documentary does not present the Crusades as a simple story of one religion attacking another. It examines political power, religious belief, economic interest, and historical memory as overlapping forces. Where historians disagree, those disagreements will be presented as disagreements. Because the truth of what happened across 2 centuries of holy war is more complicated, more human, and more relevant than either side of the modern debate wants you to know. This is the full story. Chapter 1. The World Before the Call. Picture a farmer in northern France in the year 1000. He has never traveled more than 20 miles from the village where he was born. He cannot read. He has never seen a map, but he knows, with absolute certainty, the location of the most important place in the world. It is a city called Jerusalem, 3,000 miles away, and it is the place where God walked on earth, where the sky tore open at the moment of the crucifixion, and where, many believe, the final judgment of all humanity will one day occur. That certainty, shared across much of Western European Christian society, regardless of social rank or education, is the foundation without which nothing that follows makes sense. The Crusades did not begin with armies or politics or papal ambition, though all of those things shaped them profoundly. They began with a geography of the sacred that was as real to the people who inhabited it as the fields they farmed and the church bells they heard every morning of their lives. Now picture a different person, a young nobleman in the same era, son of a minor lord in Burgundy, trained since childhood to fight, to ride, and to occupy the precise social role that his birth assigned him. He has land, but not enough. He has ambition, but no obvious outlet for it. He carries, like every knight of his generation, the accumulated weight of violence done in tournaments, in border disputes, in the casual brutality that feudal military culture produced and the church repeatedly condemned. He goes to confession. He does penance. The weight does not lift. These 2 people, the farmer who has never left his village and the knight who cannot find peace in the world he was born into, represent the 2 streams of motivation that would combine, in November of 1095, to produce one of the most extraordinary mass movements in human history. Understanding why they both responded to the same call requires understanding the world they were living in, a world that felt, to many of its inhabitants, profoundly out of order. The year 1000 did not feel like a new beginning to the people living through it. It felt, to many, like the edge of something. The Christian church had spent decades wrestling with prophecies about the end of the first millennium. And while the apocalypse failed to arrive on schedule, the anxiety it produced did not simply disappear. It settled into the bones of European society like a low fever, a persistent sense that the world was broken, that something sacred had been lost, and that God was waiting for his people to act. But anxiety alone does not produce crusades. What produces crusades is anxiety combined with opportunity. And in the year 1000, the political landscape of the known world was shifting in ways that would make both the call to holy war, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Start with the Christian world itself, because it was not one world. In 1054, in what historians call the Great Schism, the Christian Church formally split into two branches: the Roman Catholic Church in the West, centered in Rome under the authority of the Pope, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople under the authority of the Patriarch. The split was about theology, about the precise wording of a single line in the Nicene Creed. But underneath that theological argument was something older and more consequential. It was a dispute about power, about who held ultimate authority over the Christian world, about whether Rome or Constantinople sat at the center of God's kingdom on earth. That wound was fresh and unhealed when Pope Urban II stood up at Clermont in 1095 and called the First Crusade. It shaped everything that followed. The Roman Catholic Church of 1095 was also fighting a different and equally urgent battle closer to home. For most of the 11th century, the papacy had been locked in a bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over a question that sounds bureaucratic but carried enormous stakes. Who had the right to appoint bishops? This conflict, known to historians as the investiture controversy, was at its core a fight over whether the Church answered to God through Rome, or whether it could be subordinated to the political interests of secular rulers. Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV had fought this battle with such intensity that Gregory actually excommunicated Henry, forcing the most powerful secular ruler in Europe to stand barefoot in the snow outside a castle in northern Italy for 3 days, begging forgiveness. It remains one of the most extraordinary scenes of medieval political theater ever recorded. By the time Urban II came to power in 1088, the papacy had won important battles in this conflict, but had not won the war. The Pope's authority over secular rulers remained contested, uncertain, and vulnerable. Urban needed something that would demonstrate to all of Europe that the Bishop of Rome commanded a loyalty that no emperor could match. He was still looking for that project when a letter arrived from Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire in 1095 was a state in serious trouble. Once the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium had spent the second half of the 11th century absorbing blow after blow. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantine army suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in its history at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The Emperor Romanos IV was captured on the battlefield, the first Byzantine emperor to be taken prisoner by an enemy in the field. The loss of Anatolia, the agricultural heartland that had fed and funded the Byzantine military for centuries, left Constantinople structurally weakened in ways that no single victory could reverse. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had stabilized the empire's finances and rebuilt some of its military capacity by 1095. But he faced a simple arithmetic problem. He did not have enough soldiers. His letter to Pope Urban asked for military assistance, describing the difficulties facing pilgrims trying to reach Jerusalem and the threat posed by the Seljuks. It was a diplomatic document, carefully calibrated to appeal to Western religious sensibilities while making a fundamentally practical military request. Alexios wanted soldiers he could pay and command. He had no idea what he was about to receive instead. Now hold something important in mind. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control since 637 CE. When the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab accepted the city's peaceful surrender from the Byzantine Patriarch, that was more than 450 years before the First Crusade. For most of those centuries, Christian pilgrims had traveled to Jerusalem with reasonable freedom. The city was sacred to three religions simultaneously, and the various Muslim rulers who governed it had, with some significant exceptions, maintained a policy of tolerating Christian pilgrimage because pilgrims brought commerce, and commerce was useful. The historian Thomas Asbridge, in his comprehensive study of the Crusades, is careful to distinguish between the periodic difficulties that pilgrims faced and the systematic persecution that later Crusade propaganda described. What had genuinely changed was the political situation in Anatolia. The Seljuk conquest of Asia Minor had disrupted the overland routes that pilgrims had used for centuries, making the journey to Jerusalem dramatically more dangerous and expensive than it had been a generation earlier. That disruption was real. But the gap between pilgrimage has become more difficult, and Christians are being persecuted, and the holy places desecrated, was a gap that papal rhetoric would deliberately widen in the months ahead. To understand why so many people responded to the call, you have to understand what Jerusalem meant to them. Not what it means to a modern secular audience, but what it meant to a medieval Christian living in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was not a metaphor but a literal description of reality. Jerusalem was not simply a historically significant city. It was, in the theological geography of medieval Christianity, the center of the world. Maps of the period placed Jerusalem at their literal center. It was the site of Christ's crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. To travel there was not tourism or even ordinary pilgrimage. It was an act of participation in sacred history, a physical journey that compressed centuries of spiritual meaning into the experience of walking where Christ had walked. Think about that farmer in northern France again. He will never see a painting of Jerusalem. He has no photograph, no illustration, no documentary. What he has is the priest's voice every Sunday, the stained glass windows of his local church depicting scenes from Scripture, and the absolute conviction, shared by everyone he has ever known, that this city is the axis around which all of human history turns. When someone tells him that city is in danger, the response is not abstract. It is visceral. It is personal. It is as immediate as if someone had threatened his own village. The Seljuk Turks, who had disrupted the pilgrimage routes, were not a unified power with a single agenda. The Muslim world of 1095 was a fragmented landscape of competing dynasties, theological disputes between Sunni and Shia branches of Islam, and regional rivalries whose internal divisions would prove to be one of the most important factors in the First Crusade's unexpected success. Jerusalem itself was actually controlled in 1095, not by the Seljuks, but by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, a Shia Muslim dynasty that was itself in active political conflict with the Seljuk Sunnis. None of this complexity reached the ears of the crowds gathering at Clermont to hear Urban preach. What they heard was simpler, more urgent, and far more emotionally powerful than a nuanced account of Byzantine geopolitics. There is one more element of this world that deserves careful attention before we follow Urban to Clermont. That element is violence. Western European society in the late 11th century was saturated with it in ways that created specific social pressures the Crusade would partly absorb and redirect. The knightly class had been trained from childhood in the culture of combat. The church had spent decades trying to limit the damage this class of professional warriors inflicted on civilian populations through movements known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The problem, as the historian Jonathan Riley Smith observed in his foundational studies of Crusade motivation, was that you could not simply tell men whose entire identity was built around fighting to stop fighting. You could redirect that violence. You could give it a sacred purpose. You could tell that knight from Burgundy, the one carrying the weight of years of violence and failed penance, that there was a war in which his sword was not a sin but a sacrament, in which every mile walked toward Jerusalem was a mile walked toward absolution. That is exactly what Urban II was preparing to offer, and the world he was offering it to was ready in ways that perhaps even he did not fully understand. The stage was set. The political crisis was real. The theological language was available. The social pressure was building. All it needed was a speech. Chapter 2. The Pope's Gamble. Clermont, 1095. Picture the field outside the city of Clermont on November 27th, 1095. It is late autumn in central France. The air is cold. Thousands of people have gathered. Far more than anyone expected. Far more than any building in the city could hold. Bishops, abbots, minor nobles, priests, and ordinary people pressed together in the open air to hear a man speak. That man is Pope Urban II, and what he is about to say will set in motion a chain of events that the world is still living with. Here is a fact that most popular accounts of the Crusades quietly skip over. We do not know what Urban actually said. We have 4 written accounts of the speech. They were composed by 4 different men, all of whom claim to have been present or to have had access to eyewitness testimony. They agree on the basic outline. Urban called for a military expedition to the east. He invoked the suffering of Christians. He promised spiritual rewards to those who went. But when you read the 4 accounts side by side, as the historian Dana Munro did in his careful comparative analysis, the specific words, the specific arguments, and even the specific promises differ in ways that cannot be explained by imperfect memory alone. Fulcher of Chartres, who was almost certainly present at Clermont, wrote his version years after the event. Robert the Monk, whose account became the most widely copied version in the medieval period, was writing decades later and almost certainly shaped his text to reflect what the speech had come to mean, rather than precisely what was said. The historians H.E.J. Cowdrey and Jean Flory, who have studied the Clermont sources more carefully than perhaps anyone in the 20th century, both conclude that recovering Urban's precise words is impossible, and that the surviving accounts should be treated as evidence of how the Crusades' origins were understood and narrated, rather than as verbatim transcripts. This matters enormously, because the 4 accounts disagree on the single most important question. What exactly did Urban promise to those who went? The most widely copied version, by Robert the Monk, presents Urban as promising full remission of sins to anyone who took the cross, not simply a reduction of time spent in purgatory, a complete spiritual cleansing, a guarantee that the act of crusading would wipe the slate clean regardless of what a man had done in his previous life. The historian Jonathan Riley Smith argued in his landmark work on the First Crusade that this promise was the single most important factor in explaining the mass response to Urban's call. Medieval Christians lived with a constant awareness of sin and its consequences. For knights whose professional lives were built around killing, the accumulated spiritual debt was enormous. Urban was offering something that no amount of ordinary penance could provide. He was offering an exit from the spiritual arithmetic that weighed on every Christian soul. Riley Smith's interpretation has been contested. The historian Marcus Bull, in his study of lay piety and the origins of crusading, argued that the evidence for mass participation driven primarily by fear of damnation is thinner than Riley Smith suggests, and that other motivations, adventure, solidarity with fellow Christians, and genuine devotion to the holy places, played equally important roles. The honest answer is that motivation varied by individual, and any single explanation for why hundreds of thousands of people took the cross over the following 2 centuries is almost certainly too simple. What we can say with more confidence is what Urban needed the speech to accomplish, because his political situation in 1095 is better documented than the speech itself. Urban had become pope in 1088, in the middle of the investiture controversy. He inherited a papacy powerful in theory and vulnerable in practice. He also inherited a specific and immediate problem. There was another pope. The Emperor Henry IV had sponsored an anti-pope, Clement III, who controlled Rome itself. Urban spent years governing the Catholic Church from southern Italy because he literally could not safely enter his own capital city. A successful military expedition to the Holy Land, launched at papal initiative and organized under papal authority, would accomplish several things simultaneously. It would demonstrate that the Pope could mobilize the military resources of all of Christendom in a way that no emperor could match. It would redirect the violent energy of the knightly class toward a sacred purpose. It would potentially begin healing the breach with Constantinople. And it would give every Christian in Europe a shared project, a shared identity, a shared purpose larger than any local political conflict. The political genius of Urban's call was that it transformed the fractured, internally divided world of Western Christendom into something that could imagine itself as a unified people answering a single divine command. Now picture what happened after Urban finished speaking. The crowd did not simply applaud or murmur approval. A sound rose from thousands of throats simultaneously. A sound that witnesses recorded with the same 2 words in every version of the speech that survives. Deus vult. God wills it. Whether this cry was spontaneous or, as some historians have suggested, organized in advance as a kind of liturgical response. What no account disputes is its force. Men wept. Men fell to their knees in the cold field. Men who had ridden to Clermont with no intention of going anywhere turned to each other and began talking about when they would leave. The historian Jonathan Riley Smith, in his study of the First Crusade, describes the scene at Clermont as one of the most consequential moments of mass emotional mobilization in medieval history. What Urban had done was not simply make an argument. He had given the farmer, the knight, the priest, and the minor noble standing in that field a single story in which all of them had a role. They were God's people. The holy city was in danger. The call had come, and to refuse it was not merely cowardice. It was disobedience to the divine will. Urban spent the following months traveling through France, preaching the crusade and building the organizational framework for a military expedition scheduled to depart on August 15th, 1096, the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin. He appointed the bishop Adhemar of Le Puy as papal legate, the official representative of the church who would travel with the army, providing spiritual authority and, Urban hoped, a check on the inevitable political conflicts between the noble leaders. What Urban could not control was what happened before his carefully organized expedition had even assembled. The word had gone out. Preachers spread across France and the Rhineland, carrying the message to audiences that were not bishops and knights but farmers, craftsmen, minor clergy, and the desperately poor. And those audiences heard something in the message that Urban had not quite intended, or at least had not intended to act on so immediately and so chaotically. They heard that God was calling them, not just the knights, not just the nobles, all of them. The consequences of that hearing would arrive before Urban's official expedition had taken a single step, and they would be, depending on how you look at them, either the purest expression of what the crusade was really about, or its first and most revealing tragedy. Chapter 3. The People's Crusade. When faith became a mob. Before a single knight of the official First Crusade had buckled on his armor, a different kind of crusade was already moving east. It had no formal military structure. It had no supply train. It had no coherent strategy for what it would do when it arrived at Jerusalem, or how it would get there, or what it would eat along the way. What it had was faith, enormous, consuming, absolutely genuine faith. And that faith, combined with the social desperation of the people who carried it, would produce the first of many moments in crusading history when the gap between the holy and the horrific collapsed entirely. The man most responsible for this first wave was known as Peter the Hermit, a preacher from Amiens in northern France, small in physical stature by the accounts we have, riding a donkey rather than a war horse, wearing a rough woolen robe rather than armor. He held no high church office. He had no noble title. What he had was a voice and an extraordinary ability to communicate the emotional content of Urban's message to people who had never attended a church council and never would. The people who gathered to hear Peter were not primarily knights. They were peasants, minor craftsmen, wandering clergy, women, children, and the elderly. They were people for whom the promise of spiritual liberation carried a weight that the more comfortable classes could not fully feel, because their lives were already desperate in ways that made the hardships of a long march toward Jerusalem seem, if not attractive, at least no worse than what they already faced. The historian Peter Frankopan, in his study of the First Crusade, describes the People's Crusade as a genuine mass movement driven by real religious conviction, not simply a mob of the desperate and the deluded. That distinction matters. The people who followed Peter the Hermit were not irrational within the theological framework they inhabited. The promise Urban had made was the most valuable thing anyone had ever offered them. They were responding to an extraordinary offer in the only way available to them. The tragedy of what followed was not stupidity. It was the collision between sincere faith and the brutal arithmetic of medieval logistics. Estimates of how many people joined this movement vary widely and are difficult to verify from the sources available. But the numbers were clearly substantial, representing a cross-section of French and German society that no institutional military campaign would have recruited. But before the People's Crusade even reached the eastern frontier of Christendom, it produced an episode that most popular histories treat as a footnote. It was not a footnote. It was, in many ways, the most revealing event of the entire crusading era. In the spring of 1096, as groups inspired by the call to crusade moved through the Rhineland, they turned on the Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley. The attacks that followed, at Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and other cities, killed thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. In some cities, local bishops attempted to protect the Jewish population and partially succeeded. In others, the crusading crowds could not be stopped. The theological logic, if it can be called that, was articulated by some of the Crusades' popular preachers in terms that were explicit and deeply disturbing. Why? The argument went, should we travel thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ when the enemies of Christ live among us? The historian Robert Chasen, in his careful study of the Rhineland attacks, distinguishes between the Church's official position, which did not sanction violence against Jews, and the popular religious culture that the preaching of the Crusade had unleashed. Urban had not called for this, but the emotional logic of holy war, once released into a population that already carried deep anti-Jewish prejudice as a cultural inheritance, could not be contained by official disapproval alone. This is one of the most important and most uncomfortable truths of the entire crusading era. The same sincerity of faith that drove people to extraordinary sacrifice could coexist with, and sometimes fuel, acts of extraordinary cruelty. These were not different populations expressing different impulses. They were often the same people, expressing the same religious conviction in different directions. Understanding that fact is essential to understanding not just the Crusades, but the broader history of how religious conviction and human violence have always been capable of intertwining. Peter the Hermit's main force reached the Byzantine frontier in the spring and summer of 1096. Emperor Alexios I was appalled. He had asked for mercenaries. He was receiving a disorganized mass of people, many of them non-combatants, moving toward Constantinople with no clear military leadership, limited supplies, and a tendency to treat the countryside they passed through as a source of provisions regardless of who owned it. Alexios moved them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as he could. He warned their leaders not to advance too far without proper military support. The warning went unheeded. In October of 1096, the main body of the People's Crusade advanced into Seljuk territory and was destroyed. At a place near Civitate, a Turkish army ambushed the force, and the result was catastrophic. Peter the Hermit himself survived because he had returned to Constantinople before the disaster. Most of his followers did not. The survivors who were not killed were enslaved. The People's Crusade was over. It had accomplished nothing in military terms. But something about this failure demands more than a simple military verdict. The people who died at Civitate had walked from France and Germany through the Balkans in summer heat, sustained by a faith so powerful that it overrode every practical calculation about what they were doing. Many of them were not equipped for combat. They had no siege equipment, no supply infrastructure. They had only the absolute conviction that God was with them. The historian Jean Flory, in his study of the People's Crusade, resists the temptation to treat these people simply as victims of clerical manipulation or mass hysteria. Their faith was real. What destroyed them was not lack of conviction, but the intersection of genuine religious fervor with the hard material facts of medieval warfare, for which conviction alone was never going to be sufficient. The official expedition was now assembling across Europe, 4 armies under 4 ambitious leaders, each bringing a different set of motivations, a different political agenda, and a different understanding of what victory would mean. Between them and Jerusalem stood not just 1,000 miles of hostile territory, but a Muslim world more divided against itself than the Crusaders could have hoped. What happened next should not have worked. The fact that it did tells you something important about both the extraordinary determination of the people who made it happen and the political fractures of the world they were entering. Chapter 4. The First Crusade. The campaign that should not have worked. In the summer of 1096, 4 separate armies began moving toward Constantinople from different directions across Europe. They shared a destination and a stated purpose. They shared almost nothing else. The army from Lorraine was led by Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke of moderate wealth and genuine piety, whose reputation for personal courage was well established and whose political skills were, by most accounts, considerably less impressive. Godfrey had funded his expedition partly by extracting money from Jewish communities in the Rhineland, a fact that sits uncomfortably alongside his later reputation as the ideal Christian knight. The army from southern France was led by Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, the oldest of the major leaders and in many ways the most politically experienced. Raymond had fought Muslims before in the ongoing conflict in Spain known as the Reconquista, and he understood, better than some of his fellow leaders, that wars against Muslim powers were not automatically won by religious enthusiasm. He considered himself the natural leader of the entire expedition and spent much of the campaign in furious political conflict with the other princes over precedence and strategic authority. From southern Italy came Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman lord whose father had carved out a kingdom in southern Italy from what had previously been Byzantine territory. Bohemond was, by the consensus of historians including Thomas Asbridge and John France, the most gifted purely military commander of the First Crusade. He was also the most transparently ambitious, the least interested in the religious mission as an end in itself, and the most clear-eyed about the personal opportunities a successful campaign in the East might provide. Emperor Alexios I watched all 4 armies arrive at Constantinople with the careful attention of a man who had asked for a modest loan and received instead 4 heavily armed house guests with very different ideas about how to spend it. What Alexios had wanted was mercenary soldiers he could incorporate into his existing military structure. What he received were independent military forces led by ambitious Western nobles who had taken a vow to God, not to him, and whose understanding of the expedition's purpose was focused on Jerusalem rather than on Alexios's territorial needs. The negotiations that followed were among the most consequential diplomatic exchanges of the medieval period. Alexios required each of the crusading leaders to swear an oath of loyalty to him and to promise that any former Byzantine territory they reconquered would be returned to imperial control. Most of the leaders swore, some with more sincerity than others. Bohemond swore with the enthusiasm of a man who had already decided that the oath applied only to territories Byzantium could actually enforce a claim. This oath question established from the very beginning a structural ambiguity at the heart of the expedition. Were these armies fighting for Christendom under the leadership of the Pope's legate? Were they fighting as vassals of the Byzantine emperor? Were they fighting for their own political and territorial ambitions? The answer, depending on which leader you asked and on which day you asked it, was all 3 simultaneously. That ambiguity would haunt the crusade from Anatolia to Jerusalem and define the political character of everything the Crusaders built afterward. The combined force crossed into Anatolia in the spring of 1097 and achieved its first major objective with unexpected ease. The Seljuk city of Nicaea was besieged in May. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, had initially underestimated the threat, having watched the People's Crusade be destroyed the previous autumn. He returned from a campaign elsewhere to find his capital already under siege by a force far larger and better organized than anything he had faced before. What happened at Nicaea illustrated both the Crusade's military effectiveness and its political complications in a single sequence. The city was cut off. Kilij Arslan, attacked to relieve it, and was repulsed with significant losses. Facing inevitable fall, the city's garrison secretly negotiated a surrender directly to Alexios's Byzantine forces, who accepted the city on behalf of the emperor before the crusading armies could storm it and claim the plunder they expected. The crusaders were furious. They had done the work. Alexios had taken the prize. This moment of friction established a pattern of mutual suspicion between the Western armies and their Byzantine ally that would widen steadily over the following months and years. The march south through Anatolia that followed was one of the most brutal experiences of the entire campaign. The heat of a central Anatolian summer is ferocious. Water sources are sparse. The roads crossed mountain passes and semi-arid plains that provided almost nothing in the way of forage for an army of tens of thousands plus the horses, mules, and livestock that traveled with it. At Dorylaeum, in early July of 1097, Kili Arslan attacked again, this time catching Bohemon's vanguard force before it could unite with the rest of the army. The Turkish cavalry used the hit-and-run tactics of the Eurasian steppe tradition, showering the crusading infantry with arrows and withdrawing before they could be engaged directly. A method of fighting that the heavily armored Western knights found deeply frustrating and genuinely dangerous. Bohemond held his force together through a combination of tactical discipline and personal example, while sending urgent calls for reinforcement. When the relief came and the full crusading force engaged, the Turks withdrew. The battle was won, but the margin had been uncomfortable, and the lesson was absorbed by those capable of learning it. The Muslim armies of Anatolia were not going to stand and fight the kind of close-quarters engagement in which the crusading knights excelled. They were going to use mobility and attrition to grind the invaders down. The army that reached the outskirts of Antioch in October of 1097 was already significantly smaller than the one that had left Constantinople. Disease, thirst, combat casualties, and the slow attrition of months of marching through hostile territory had taken their toll. Antioch was a city of enormous strategic and symbolic importance. It was one of the great cities of the ancient world, the place where, according to the Acts of the Apostles, followers of Jesus were first called Christians. It was also a heavily fortified city, with walls stretching for miles across difficult mountainous terrain. Garrisoned by a Turkish force under the commander Yagi Siyan, what followed was one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire crusading era. The siege unfolded in two distinct and grueling phases. In the first, lasting from October of 1097 to June of 1098, the crusading army besieged the city from the outside. In the second, after the city was finally taken, the crusading army found itself besieged from the outside by a Muslim relief force. The historian John France, in his detailed military history of the First Crusade, documents the famine conditions that developed during the winter months of the first phase, when foraging parties were ambushed by Turkish cavalry and supply lines from the coast were repeatedly disrupted. Some of the noble leaders abandoned the expedition during this period, including one memorably recorded in the sources as Stephen of Blois, who wrote cheerful letters home to his wife, describing how well things were going just days before he fled the siege. The crusade survived the winter through a combination of determination, desperation, and, as the historian Jonathan Phillips has noted, remarkable good fortune. Byzantine supply ships reached the coast and provided enough food to prevent complete collapse, and Bohemond, whose network of contacts inside the city had been working quietly for months, made contact with an Armenian guard commander named Firuz, who was willing to betray his post. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond's men gained entry through the section Firuz controlled and opened the city from within. Antioch fell within hours, and the day after they took it, a Muslim relief force of enormous size arrived and besieged the besiegers. The army, now trapped inside Antioch, was in desperate condition. Food was running out again. In this moment of maximum desperation, a priest named Peter Bartholomew reported a vision. St. Andrew had appeared to him. He said, and revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. An excavation was organized. After hours of digging, Peter Bartholomew jumped into the pit and emerged holding a fragment of iron. Was it genuine? Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy was privately skeptical, and the historian Thomas Asbridge notes that the evidential problems with the account were apparent to some contemporaries at the time. But the question of authenticity is, in some ways, less important than what the lance did for the people who chose to believe in it. It gave an army on the edge of collapse a sign that God had not abandoned them. It gave them a reason to fight when the arithmetic of their situation said they should surrender. On June 28, 1098, the crusading army marched out of Antioch to face the relief force. They were weak, hungry, and heavily outnumbered. The Muslim relief force, commanded by Kerboha of Mosul, broke and fled. The reasons are still debated by historians. The relief force was itself politically divided, composed of contingents from different rulers who had their own reasons for not wanting Kerboga to emerge from the campaign dramatically more powerful. Some contingents withdrew before the battle was decided. The crusading attack, whatever its numerical disadvantages, was pressed with the intensity of men who believed they were fighting alongside saints. The combination of political fracture in the Muslim force and extraordinary commitment in the crusading force produced an outcome that neither side should have expected. The army rested at Antioch for months afterward, too depleted to continue. Bishop Adhemar, the expedition's moral center, died of typhus in August of 1098. His death removed the one figure who had the papal authority and the personal respect to hold the political contradictions of the expedition together. Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself. The first Crusader state had been created, not by plan, but by the logic of ambition, operating in the absence of restraint. The march to Jerusalem resumed in January of 1099. The army that moved south was a shadow of the force that had left Constantinople 18 months earlier. It was also a force transformed by everything it had survived. These were veterans of one of the most difficult military campaigns in medieval history, hardened by 2 years of combat, disease, and famine, shaped by the specific psychological experience of having survived things that should have killed them. They interpreted that survival as confirmation. God had preserved them. God was with them. Jerusalem was waiting. The city they reached in June of 1099 was not even held by the Seljuk Turks who had triggered the crusade. In the months before the crusading army arrived, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt had retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks. The Fatimids had actually sent diplomatic missions to the crusading army during the march, exploring whether some accommodation was possible. Those negotiations had gone nowhere. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 5 weeks. On July 15th, 1099, the crusading forces breached the walls. What followed has been described and debated more than almost any event of the medieval period. The sources, both Christian and Muslim, describe widespread killing of the city's population. The historian Benjamin Kadar in his careful analysis of the sources, concludes that while some of the extreme figures given in the accounts are almost certainly exaggerated, the killing was real, widespread, and organized, rather than simply the spontaneous chaos of troops entering a city. It was also, and this tension is essential to hold, experienced by its perpetrators as a moment of transcendent holiness. The surviving Crusaders walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping, embracing each other, praying with a fervor that every eyewitness describes as genuine and overwhelming. The knight from Normandy, kneeling on stones darkened with blood, was not performing. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was in the presence of God. That is perhaps the most difficult truth of the First Crusade. The horror and the holiness were not separate experiences felt by different people at different times. They were the same experience, felt by the same people in the same moment. Understanding that is essential to understanding not just the Crusades, but the broader and permanent human capacity to hold the highest aspirations and the lowest impulses simultaneously. In the same heart, in the same action, Jerusalem was taken. A kingdom would now be built upon it. And the question of what kind of kingdom it would be and how long it could last was about to reveal everything that the First Crusade's political ambiguities had left unresolved. Chapter 5. Building OUTREMER, Kingdom or Colony. On July 22nd, 1099, 1 week after the fall of Jerusalem, the surviving leaders gathered to decide who would rule the city they had just taken. Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the lordship of Jerusalem. He accepted, but refused the title of king. He would not, he said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The title he accepted instead was Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, positioning him as protector of the sacred sites rather than a conventional secular ruler. The historian Adrian Boas, in his detailed study of Crusader society, notes that Godfrey's refusal of the royal title was almost certainly as much political calculation as piety. The question of whether Jerusalem's ruler answered primarily to the Pope or to his own secular authority was genuinely unresolved, and a title that sidestepped the issue was diplomatically useful. But the pious framing was also sincere. The two motivations coexisted in him without apparent contradiction, as they coexisted in the broader crusade itself. Godfrey died in July of 1100, barely a year after the conquest. His brother Baldwin, who had no such scruples about royal titles, was crowned King of Jerusalem on Christmas Day 1100, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was formally constituted as a political entity. But the Kingdom of Jerusalem was only one of 4 political entities the First Crusade had created. Bohemond held Antioch as its prince. Baldwin's cousin had carved out the county of Edessa in what is now southeastern Turkey, and Raymond of Saint-Gilles eventually established the county of Tripoli on the Lebanese coast. These 4 states, which historians collectively call the Crusader states, or by the French term Outremer, meaning beyond the sea, were the political legacy of the First Crusade. Now picture the kingdom from the inside. You are a Muslim farmer in the hills above Jaffa in the year 1120. Your family has farmed this land for generations. The Crusaders who arrived 20 years ago killed many of your neighbors and drove others away. But you are still here. You pay taxes now to a Frankish lord rather than to the officials who came before. You cannot bear arms. If you appear in court against a Christian plaintiff, the legal scales are not balanced in your favor. But you are still farming. Your family is still intact. The markets are functioning. Trade is moving through the ports. Your situation is neither the romantic coexistence that older histories sometimes described, nor the total oppression that the simplest readings of the Crusader states suggest. It is something more complicated, more ambiguous, and more human than either of those framings captures. Understanding what the Crusader states actually were requires looking honestly at the structure of power in OUTREMER, and at who held it and who did not. The ruling class was Western European in origin, Catholic in religion, and French in language and culture. This small elite controlled the major cities, the castles, the ports, and the agricultural land. They governed a population that was overwhelmingly not like them. The majority of the people living under Crusader rule were Muslims, Eastern Christians of various denominations including Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, and Coptic communities, and Jews. These populations had been living in the Levant for centuries. They knew the land, the agricultural systems, the trade routes, and the political relationships of the region in ways that the newly arrived Western lords did not and could not. The Crusader lords needed these populations. They needed the Muslim and Eastern Christian peasants to farm the land that produced the agricultural surplus that funded everything else. They needed the merchants who maintained the commercial networks that connected OUTREMER to the broader Mediterranean economy. What they created was a layered society that the historian Joshua Prawer, in his foundational study of the Crusader kingdom, described using the explicit language of settler colonial analysis. Prawer argued that the Crusader states represented a pattern in which a foreign elite maintained political and military control over a subject population while depending on that population's labor and knowledge for their own economic survival, without integrating the subject population into the ruling class or granting them the political rights that the ruling class reserved for itself. Prawer's framework has been contested. The historian Ronnie Ellenblum, in his archaeological study of Frankish rural settlement, challenged the picture of complete separation between rulers and ruled, presenting evidence of more complex patterns of interaction in some rural areas. The historian Benjamin Kadar has documented both the discriminatory legal structures that subordinated non-Catholic populations and the practical accommodations that made daily life across communal lines possible and sometimes cooperative. The honest picture is neither the old romantic image of Crusader knights as pure religious warriors nor a simple model of total oppression. It is more complicated and more interesting than either. Now picture a different kind of visitor to OUTREMER in the 12th century. His name is Usama ibn Munkit. He is a Syrian nobleman, warrior, and writer who spent time at the Crusader court of Jerusalem and left a memoir that is one of the most valuable non-European perspectives on the Crusader states that survives. He describes a Frankish knight who regularly invited him to pray in a small chapel that had been converted for Christian use, and who one day had to physically restrain a newly arrived Crusader from the West who objected to the presence of a Muslim praying in a Christian space. The newly arrived knight did not understand that the rules of coexistence in OUTREMER were different from what he had imagined before he left home. The local Crusader did understand. He had been living with those rules for years. Usama is simultaneously fascinated and appalled by the Franks he encounters. He describes their medical practices with barely concealed horror, their gender relations with genuine bewilderment, and their judicial customs with scholarly curiosity. But he also describes friendships, shared meals, and genuine hospitality crossing the religious divide. his account captures something the simple model of total separation misses. The Crusader states were strange, hybrid, contested spaces in which people of radically different backgrounds navigated proximity in ways that produced both conflict and unexpected connection. The economic structure of OUTREMER revealed its dependencies with uncomfortable clarity. The Crusader states could not sustain themselves commercially without the Italian maritime city-states, principally Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. These cities had provided naval support during the Crusade and its aftermath, and in exchange received extraordinary commercial privileges, including their own quarters in the major cities, their own courts, and in some cases, exemption from the customs duties that other merchants paid. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, represent one of the most genuinely original institutional inventions of the crusading era. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugh of Payens, initially as a small brotherhood committed to protecting pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. They established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and from that location took their name. Pope Honorius II gave them formal papal recognition in 1128. Both orders attracted donations of land and money from across Europe on a scale that made them, within a few decades, among the wealthiest institutions in Christendom. The Templars developed, partly from the practical necessity of managing assets across long distances, a system of transferable credit that the historian Julien Loiseau describes as one of the early institutional experiments in long-distance financial instruments in the medieval Western world. A meaningful step in the longer chain of development that would contribute to the financial innovations of subsequent centuries. The connection is not a direct line of institutional descent, but it represents a real contribution to a tradition of practice that mattered. By the middle of the 12th century, the Crusader states had been in existence for half a century. The second generation of Crusader settlers, born in the Levant rather than in Europe, spoke Arabic alongside French and had relationships with the surrounding communities that their parents had not. The historian Jonathan Phillips describes this second generation as genuinely of the East in ways that complicated the simple picture of permanent foreign occupation. But the structural vulnerabilities were real and persistent. OUTREMER was a thin coastal strip surrounded by Muslim powers that were, if divided among themselves, capable of enormous military strength when unified. The population was never large enough to defend their territory without constant reinforcement from Europe. The loyalty of the majority population to the Crusader political order was, at best, conditional and pragmatic. The Crusader states contained structural features that later historians can meaningfully compare to forms of colonial expansion. A foreign elite, defined by religion and geographic origin, established political and military control over a majority population through conquest, reserved political rights and legal advantages for itself, and relied on the labor and commerce of subject populations, while maintaining their subordinate status through a combination of law and force. Whether you use the word colonial or not, those structural features were real, and they shaped every dimension of life in OUTREMER. What you cannot honestly do is describe the Crusader states as simply a religious enterprise. The Kingdom of Jerusalem collected taxes. It ran courts. It administered land. The religious mission and the political and economic enterprise were not separable. They were the same project, conducted simultaneously by the same people, in the same territory. That was OUTREMER at its height. A kingdom built on genuine faith, sustained by systematic advantage, dependent on external support it could never fully control. and surrounded by a Muslim world that was, even in its most divided state, more deeply rooted in the land than the Crusaders would ever be. What it needed to survive in the long term was for the surrounding Muslim world to remain divided. For half a century, that condition more or less held. Then, a man was born in the mountains of what is now northern Iraq, and the world the Crusaders had built began, slowly and then very quickly, to change. Chapter 6. Saladin and the world the Crusaders did not understand. Picture a young man in his mid-20s, somewhere in Syria, in the year 1164. He has been ordered to travel to Egypt as part of his uncle's military force, and he does not want to go. Egypt is distant. The mission is dangerous, and the political complications are formidable. He is a staff officer, not a commander. He has no particular reason to believe that this reluctant journey will change anything about his life in a fundamental way. His given name is Yusuf. History will know him by his honorific, Saladin, righteousness of the faith. The Western world will compress that into Saladin, and the journey he does not want to take will set in motion the events that lead, 23 years later, to the fall of Jerusalem. He was born around 1138 in Tikrit, a town on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, into a Kurdish family whose fortunes were tied to the military service of Turkish rulers. His father was a competent administrator. His uncle Shirkuh was a military commander of considerable skill and considerable ambition. The boy grew up in the world of 12th century Islamic military politics, learning its customs, its loyalties, and its ruthlessness from the inside. The man who would retake Jerusalem did not begin his career as a holy warrior consumed by the desire to drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land. He began it as a junior military officer doing what junior military officers did. He fought. He administered. He navigated the complex web of personal loyalty, dynastic obligation, and religious legitimacy that determined who held power and who did not. Understanding Saladin requires first understanding the world he moved through, because the popular image of a unified Muslim world straining against the Crusader presence and needing only a great leader to drive them out is almost entirely wrong. The Muslim world of the 12th century was fractured along lines of theology, dynasty, ethnicity, and political interest that made the Crusader states, paradoxically, one of the more stable political entities in the region for much of the century. The most fundamental division was theological. The Fatimid Caliphate that controlled Egypt was Shia Muslim. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which claimed symbolic leadership of the broader Muslim world, was Sunni. The Seljuk Turks and the Zengid dynasty that ruled Syria were also Sunni. The theological gulf between Sunni and Shia Islam was not merely doctrinal. It was political, institutional, and deeply personal, shaping alliances and enmities in ways that consistently prevented the kind of unified Muslim response to the Crusader presence that modern readers might expect. The Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din, under whom Saladin served, was the first Muslim leader of the 12th century to make the ideology of jihad against the Crusaders a central element of his political identity. The historian Niall Christie, in his study of Muslim responses to the Crusades, describes Nur ad-Din as the man who first systematically used the language of holy war against the Franks as a tool of political legitimation. But even Nur ad-Din's campaigns against the Crusaders alternated with periods of accommodation when his more immediate political interests required it. The Crusader states were sometimes more useful to him as a buffer against rival Muslim powers than as an enemy to be destroyed. It was in this context of Muslim politics driven primarily by intra-Muslim rivalries that the young Saladin made his reluctant journey to Egypt in 1164. The Fatimid Caliphate that Shirkuh and Saladin were ostensibly serving was a state in advanced decay. The caliph was a teenage figurehead with no real power. The administrative apparatus was hollowed out. The military was ineffective. It was, in short, a power vacuum of enormous size, waiting for someone capable of filling it. Shirkuh became vizier of Egypt in 1169 and died 2 months later, leaving Saladin as his successor at 31 years old. He was now the effective ruler of one of the wealthiest countries in the medieval world, nominally serving a Shia caliph whose authority he did not recognize, technically subordinate to a Sunni overlord in Syria whose death he was already beginning to plan around. The political maneuvers of the following years revealed the qualities that would make Saladin the most consequential Muslim leader of the crusading era. He was patient in ways that his contemporaries frequently were not. He was willing to let others make the aggressive moves that would give him the moral and political authority to respond. And he understood, with a clarity that many rulers of his era lacked, that military power was only sustainable when it rested on a foundation of religious legitimacy and institutional loyalty. He ended Fatimid rule in Egypt in 1171, returning the country to Sunni observance, a move that dramatically enhanced his legitimacy in the broader Sunni world. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved quickly to extend his control from Egypt into Syria, maneuvering around the Zengid succession crisis with a combination of military pressure and diplomatic skill that left him, by 1186, in control of Egypt, Syria, and much of the surrounding region. The historian Anne-Marie Ede, whose biography of Saladin, published in 2008, is the most thorough scholarly examination of his career, is careful to distinguish between the Saladin of historical record and the Saladin of legend. The legendary version, embraced both by medieval Muslim panegyrists who needed a hero and by later Western romantics who found in him a noble enemy worthy of admiration, presents a figure of almost impossibly consistent virtue. The historical Saladin was capable of ruthlessness and of political calculation that contradicted his stated principles. He was a political leader operating in a brutal world, not a saint who happened to carry a sword, but he was also, by the testimony of both his admirers and his enemies, a man of genuine religious conviction and remarkable personal generosity in specific contexts. His treatment of the civilian population of Jerusalem after its reconquest in 1187 stands as one of the most documented instances of deliberate mercy in medieval military history. And it was deliberate, understood by everyone who witnessed it as a conscious contrast to what had happened in 1099. The road to Hattin began with the strategic situation that Saladin had spent 15 years constructing. By 1186, he controlled the territories surrounding the Crusader states on every side except the sea. The kingdom of Jerusalem was encircled. Its survival depended on the inability of its Muslim neighbors to unite against it, a condition that had held for nearly a century, but that Saladin's patient accumulation of power had now undermined. What gave him the political and religious justification to move from encirclement to attack was provided, with almost perfect timing, by the man the historian Thomas Madden has described as the most reckless and destructive figure in the history of the Crusader states. Reynald of Châtillon was a French lord who had built a career of extraordinary violence that repeatedly undermined the political accommodations that made coexistence in the Levant possible. He had been imprisoned by Muslim forces for 15 years after an unprovoked attack and had learned nothing from the experience. He held the castle of Carrick in Transjordan, controlling the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria, and used that control to raid Muslim caravans in violation of truces that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had negotiated and needed to maintain. In 1182, he launched a naval expedition into the Red Sea, attacking Muslim shipping and threatening the pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina. Saladin swore publicly to deal with him personally. The kingdom's political leadership was unable to restrain Reynald. The internal politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s were producing a crisis that Reynald's behavior accelerated but did not create. King Baldwin IV was dying slowly of leprosy while fighting to maintain his authority against a court faction maneuvering to inherit the throne through his sister Sibylla and her husband Guy of Lusignan. The kingdom was dividing between those who counseled caution in dealing with Saladin, principally Raymond III of Tripoli, and those who believed aggressive action was both possible and necessary. When the succession finally fell to Guy of Lusignan, the cautious faction lost the political argument. The kingdom would fight. The only question was when and where. Saladin answered both questions at the Horns of Hattin on July 4th. 1187. He crossed the Jordan River and laid siege to Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, threatening a city whose countess was the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. Raymond himself, understanding the trap, counseled the Crusader leadership not to respond. Tiberias could be retaken. An army destroyed could not be rebuilt. But Guy of Lusignan, under pressure from the aggressive faction and unwilling to be seen as a king who abandoned his subjects, ordered the army to march. The march from Safaria toward Tiberias on July 3rd, 1187, was one of the most consequential military decisions in medieval history, and it was wrong in ways that experienced commanders could see in real time. The route crossed dry plateau country in the height of a Levantine summer. Saladin's cavalry harassed the column continuously, preventing it from resting or reaching water. By the evening of July 3rd, the Crusader army had not reached water. It camped on the dry plateau, exhausted and surrounded. During the night, Saladin's forces set fire to the dry grass around the camp. By the morning of July 4th, the force had effectively ceased to function as a coherent fighting unit before the decisive engagement had even been joined. What followed at the Horns of Hattin was the systematic destruction of the army that had sustained the Crusader states for nearly a century. The True Cross was captured. Guy of Lusignan was taken prisoner. Reynald of Chatillon was brought before Saladin, who killed him personally, fulfilling the oath he had sworn years earlier. The military orders who had been captured were executed almost entirely. Saladin spared the rank-and-file knights for ransom, but ordered the killing of the Templars and Hospitallers because he understood that they were the professional backbone of the Crusader military system. It was a cold calculation, consistent with the military logic of his situation. The strategic consequences of Hattin unfolded over the following months with a speed that stunned the Christian world. Jerusalem fell on October 2nd, 1187. Saladin entered the city and did not repeat the events of 1099. The civilian population was offered terms. Those who could pay a ransom were freed. Saladin's brother reportedly purchased the freedom of thousands of poor Jerusalemites and released them. The contrast was not accidental. Saladin was a sophisticated political communicator who understood that his treatment of Jerusalem would be remembered and compared to 1099. The mercy he showed served his religious legitimacy, his political reputation, and his practical interest in avoiding the desperate resistance that a harsher policy would have provoked. All three motivations were present simultaneously. None of them cancels the others. The fall of Jerusalem sent a shockwave through Christian Europe that produced the Third Crusade. It also produced the myth of Saladin that would grow in complexity and contradictory directions for the following 8 centuries. European Christians found in Saladin's mercy a partial answer that preserved their dignity. He was, in the Western telling, a noble enemy, almost a Christian in his virtue, a man who happened to be on the wrong side of the theological divide. The Muslim tradition built a different Saladin, the perfect warrior of faith, the restorer of Jerusalem, the man who succeeded where generations before him had failed. The historian Ede's careful reconstruction of the historical Saladin is less satisfying than either legend and more interesting than both. He was a man of genuine faith who was also a brilliant political operator. He was capable of extraordinary generosity and of cold calculation. He used the ideology of holy war as both sincere motivation and political instrument. And the line between those two functions was sometimes clear to him and sometimes not. What he achieved was real and remarkable. He unified the Muslim political world around a common purpose to a degree that had not been accomplished before him. He destroyed the military capacity of the Crusader states in a single campaign season. He retook the city that had defined the Crusades' purpose since Clermont, and he did it not through superior numbers alone, but through superior strategy, superior patience, and a superior understanding of the structural vulnerabilities of the enemy he was facing. The Crusader states would not recover from Hattin. What came after? The Third Crusade, the negotiations, the partial recoveries, were ultimately a long rearguard action against a strategic reality that had been decided on a dry plateau in the Galilean summer of 1187. And the man Europe sent to answer Saladin was, in his own way, just as complicated, just as gifted, and just as misrepresented by the myths that gathered around him. Chapter 7. The Third Crusade. Richard Saladin and the War That Made Myths. When the news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in the autumn of 1180, it produced a response that was, even by the standards of the crusading era, extraordinary. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal letter Audita Tremendi, a document that attributed the loss of Jerusalem not to military failure or political dysfunction in the Crusader states, but to the sins of the Christian people. God had permitted Jerusalem to fall as punishment. The only response was repentance, renewal, and a new military expedition to recover what had been lost. 3 of the most powerful rulers in Europe took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was in his late 60s and had been the dominant political figure in European Christianity for decades. Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, a calculating and deeply intelligent ruler who had been using every available political tool to expand French royal power at the expense of his greatest rival, and the man who would inherit the English throne from his father Henry II in 1189. That man was Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, now King Richard I of England. He was 31 years old, had spent most of his adult life at war, spoke French as his primary language, had visited England perhaps twice before becoming its king, and was about to conduct the most celebrated military campaign of the medieval period in a country he had never seen, fighting for a city he had never visited. On behalf of a kingdom he regarded primarily as a source of revenue for his real interests elsewhere. The Third Crusade began with a disaster that removed the largest of the 3 armies before it ever reached the Holy Land. Frederick Barbarossa's force took the overland route through the Balkans and Anatolia. It made good progress against the resistance it encountered. Then, in June of 1190, crossing a river in southern Anatolia called the Salif, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. The accounts of exactly what happened vary. He may have been thrown from his horse while crossing. He may have tried to swim. He was in his late 60s and in full armor, and the Salif was cold and fast. Whatever the precise circumstances, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The enormous German army, deprived of its leader and its organizing purpose, largely disintegrated. Some units continued to the Holy Land. Most turned back. The largest crusading force assembled since the First Crusade had been destroyed not by Muslim arms, but by a river crossing. Philip of France and Richard of England had chosen the sea route. They traveled together in a state of mutual antagonism that would have been almost comic if it had not been so consequential. Philip and Richard had been political enemies before they took the cross and remained so throughout the crusade. Every major strategic decision, every allocation of resources, every question of precedence and authority was contested between them, not because either man was irrational, but because their political interests in France conflicted in ways that did not disappear simply because they were on crusade together. Richard's fleet was scattered by a storm in the Mediterranean, and several ships were driven to the coast of Cyprus, then ruled by a Byzantine prince named Isaac Komnenos, who had broken from Constantinople and established his own independent rule. When Richard's ships sought shelter and assistance, Isaac imprisoned the survivors and seized the cargo. One of those ships carried Richard's betrothed, Berengaria of Navarre, and his sister Joan. Richard's response was swift and total. He conquered Cyprus in roughly 3 weeks, deposed Isaac, and added the island's considerable resources to the Crusades' asset base. The conquest of Cyprus was, in military terms, one of the most efficient operations of the entire Third Crusade. It was also an act of aggression against a Christian territory that complicated Richard's relationship with Byzantium for years afterward. Richard did not appear to find this tension troubling. The main theater of the Third Crusade was already developing at Acre, the fortified port city on the Lebanese coast that a small crusader force under Guy of Lusignan had been besieging since 1189. The situation at Acre, when Richard arrived in June of 1191, was one of medieval warfare's more remarkable configurations. The crusader besieging force was itself besieged by Saladin's army on its landward side, producing a double siege of considerable complexity and mutual misery. Richard's arrival changed the military balance decisively. He brought fresh troops, supplies, and, most importantly, a capacity for systematic military organization that the siege had lacked. The historian John Gillingham, whose biography of Richard remains the most authoritative scholarly treatment, documents Richard's methodical approach to the siege with the detail of a specialist in medieval military operations. The walls were undermined. The garrison was subjected to continuous catapult bombardment. Saladin's attempts to relieve the city were repulsed. Acre surrendered on July 12, 1191. Philip of France, who had been ill through much of the siege and whose political interests at home were pressing, used the fall of Acre as an occasion to depart. He left the crusade 6 weeks after its first major success, leaving Richard as the uncontested military leader of the expedition. What followed the fall of Acre produced the single most controversial act of Richard's crusade. The terms of Acre's surrender required Saladin to pay a ransom and return the true cross within a specified time. When the deadline passed without full payment, Richard ordered the execution of a large number of Muslim prisoners. The sources differ on the precise number, with most estimates falling between 2,000 and 3,000. The episode has been interpreted in radically different ways by historians across generations. Medieval Christian sources largely accepted it as a calculated military decision made under the pressure of a campaign that could not afford to garrison or feed thousands of prisoners while on the march. Muslim sources recorded it as an atrocity. Modern historians are divided between those who, following the analysis of John Gillingham, see it as a decision within the brutal logic of medieval warfare, and those who see it as a disproportionate act that violated even the pragmatic standards of the time. What is not in dispute is that it happened, that it was ordered deliberately, and that it shaped Muslim perceptions of Richard in ways that complicated subsequent negotiations. Saladin had Christian prisoners in his custody killed in response. The cycle of violence that the Crusades had established from their earliest days continued. The march south from Acre toward Jerusalem that Richard conducted through the summer and autumn of 1191 is studied in military academies to this day as a model of disciplined operational planning. Richard moved his army in a formation designed to minimize the impact of Turkish horse archer tactics, keeping the infantry on the landward side to absorb arrow fire while the fleet moved parallel along the coast, supplying the army and providing a flank that could not be turned. He imposed extraordinary discipline on his troops, forbidding the cavalry from charging in response to arrow harassment, forcing them to absorb casualties and maintain formation until the moment of his choosing. At Arsuf in September of 1191, Saladin attacked the marching column with his full force, attempting to provoke the kind of disorganized charge that had undone Crusader armies before. The Hospitallers on the army's rear, absorbing casualties and desperate to respond, finally broke formation and charged without orders. Richard, recognizing that the situation required immediate action rather than correction, ordered a general charge that drove Saladin's forces from the field. Arsuf was a significant tactical victory. It was not strategically decisive. Saladin's army withdrew in good order, and the fundamental problem of the campaign remained unresolved. Richard could win battles. He could not hold Jerusalem if he took it. The logistical and political realities were gradually clarifying in Richard's mind through the winter of 1191 and into 1192. Jerusalem was 75 miles inland from the coast. An army that took it would be dependent on supply lines stretching across hostile country. With Saladin's forces intact and capable of cutting those lines whenever they chose, the city's walls had been reinforced. A siege would be long and vulnerable, and even if the city was taken, who would hold it? The Crusader states lacked the manpower to garrison Jerusalem properly while also defending the coastal cities. Richard advanced toward Jerusalem twice and withdrew twice, not from cowardice, but from the cold assessment that taking the city was achievable and holding it was not. The historian Malcolm Barber, in his study of the Crusader states, describes Richard's strategic logic as essentially correct given the resources available to him, a judgment that most military historians share even while acknowledging the psychological and political cost of the withdrawals. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Jaffa in September of 1192 were conducted between Richard and Saladin through intermediaries, including Saladin's brother Al-Adil, with whom Richard had developed a relationship of genuine mutual respect that both sides found diplomatically useful and personally interesting. The terms agreed were pragmatic on both sides. Christians were granted the right to visit Jerusalem as pilgrims. The Crusaders retained the coastal strip from Acre to Jaffa. A 3-year truce was established. Jerusalem was not in Christian hands. The stated purpose of the crusade had not been achieved. Richard left the Holy Land in October of 1192. was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria on his way home, held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, and returned to England after nearly 2 years of captivity to find his kingdom in disorder. He died in 1199 from a crossbow wound received at a minor siege in France, never having returned to the Holy Land that had made him famous. The myths that formed around Richard and Saladin after their deaths tell us as much about the needs of subsequent centuries as about the two men themselves. Richard became, in English tradition, the ideal of chivalric kingship, the crusading hero, the lion heart, a figure whose actual record as King of England, which was largely a story of absence and taxation, was overshadowed by the martial glory of the Crusade. Saladin became, in both the Muslim and eventually the Western tradition, the noble adversary, the proof that greatness could exist on the other side of the religious divide. Both legends served purposes that historical accuracy could not. Richard's legend gave English political culture a founding martial hero. Saladin's legend gave the Muslim world a usable model of successful resistance, and gave the Western world a way of processing the failure of the Third Crusade without fully confronting its causes. The causes were structural, and they had not changed. The Crusader states were maintained by a minority ruling class over a majority population with no strong reason to defend the system. They depended on military reinforcement from Europe that arrived irregularly and was always insufficient. They faced a Muslim political world that, when unified by a sufficiently skilled and motivated leader, possessed resources that the Crusaders could not match. The Third Crusade had demonstrated something important: military genius of the highest order, in the person of Richard, facing strategic wisdom of comparable quality, in the person of Saladin, had produced not a decisive outcome, but a negotiated stalemate that left the fundamental situation unchanged. Military force could win battles and hold coastlines. It could not, by itself, resolve whether a European Christian presence in the heart of the Islamic world could be made permanent against the will of the people among whom it had been planted. Saladin died in 1193, less than a year after the treaty, leaving behind an empire that his successors would spend the following decades fighting each other over. The man who had unified the Muslim world around a common purpose had not been able to make that unity outlast his own life. The Crusader states survived in reduced form, and in Europe, plans were already forming for the next expedition. The next expedition would not go to Jerusalem. It would not go where anyone planned, and it would end by doing something that stunned the medieval world and whose consequences are still being felt today. Chapter 8. The Fourth Crusade, the crusade that sacked the wrong city. Picture a man standing in the ruins of what had been the greatest library in the Christian world. He is a Byzantine scholar named Nicetas Choniates, and he has spent his career in the service of emperors, writing history and administering the empire that he believed was the beating heart of Christian civilization. He is watching soldiers carry armloads of manuscripts out of the building and feed them to a fire in the street below. The soldiers cannot read the language the manuscripts are written in. They do not know what they are destroying. They know only that the covers are decorated with silver and gold, and the silver and gold can be melted down and carried away. Nicetas Choniates survived the sack of Constantinople in 1204 and later wrote an account of what he witnessed that remains one of the most harrowing eyewitness documents of the entire medieval period. He was trying to process something that his entire theological and political framework had not prepared him for. The soldiers doing this were Christians. They had taken a vow to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, and they were destroying the greatest Christian city in the world. How did a crusade aimed at Egypt end by destroying Constantinople? The answer is not a simple story of conspiracy or greed. Though greed was present, the historian Donald Queller, in his careful study of the Fourth Crusade, and Thomas Madden, in his subsequent analysis, both emphasize that this was not a planned diversion. It was a chain of debt, ambition, opportunity, and political calculation that pulled the expedition off course step by step, with no single moment of deliberate betrayal of the crusading ideal. Understanding this chain is more unsettling than a simple story of villainy, because it shows how thoroughly the gap between stated purpose and actual outcome could open without anyone clearly choosing to open it. The Fourth Crusade was launched by Pope Innocent III, who became Pope in 1198 at the age of 37 and was, by any measure, one of the most politically capable men ever to hold the office. His plan was strategically sound. The real power base of Muslim resistance to the Crusades was Egypt, an expedition that struck Egypt directly, captured the Nile Delta, and used that position as leverage to negotiate the return of Jerusalem would be attacking the problem at its root rather than its branches. The leaders who assembled for the Fourth Crusade were a collection of French and Flemish nobles without a king among them. The most important figure for what followed was not technically a crusade leader at all. He was the elderly and nearly blind Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, whose city controlled the naval capacity that the expedition could not do without. The negotiations with Venice produced a contract that committed both parties to a scale of operation that was, in retrospect, optimistic in its assumptions. The Crusades' leaders estimated they would need transportation for 33,500 men and 9,000 horses. The Venetians agreed to provide it in exchange for 85,000 marks of silver, a sum so large that it consumed years of Venetian naval and commercial investment to assemble the contracted fleet. Venice also agreed to contribute 50 warships in exchange for half of whatever was conquered. This contract required a level of participation that did not materialize. When the army assembled at Venice in the summer of 1201, it numbered perhaps 11,000 to 12,000 men, roughly a third of the contracted number. They could raise only 51,000 marks rather than the 85,000 agreed. This financial shortfall was the hinge on which everything turned. The Venetians had built and equipped the contracted fleet at enormous expense and were not willing to absorb the loss. The Crusaders were in Venice, unable to leave without the ships, and unable to pay what they owed. Dandolo proposed a solution: the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a former Venetian possession, had placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. If the crusade would help Venice retake Zara, Dandolo would defer the debt. Zara was a Christian city. Its population was Catholic. Its king had himself taken the crusading vow. Attacking it was, by any coherent definition, not crusading. Innocent III explicitly forbade it. The crusade attacked Zara anyway. The city fell after a brief siege. Innocent excommunicated the entire crusading army. Then, recognizing that excommunicating the only crusading force in existence was counterproductive, lifted the excommunication on condition of repentance and continued service. Zara was the first diversion. Constantinople was the second, and its origins lay in the Byzantine succession politics that had been producing crises for decades. In 1201, a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived in the West seeking support for his claim to the Byzantine throne. His father, Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded by his own brother. The young Alexios promised extraordinary rewards to anyone who would help restore his father. He promised the reunification of the Orthodox and Catholic churches under Roman authority. He promised 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the crusade. He promised 200,000 marks of silver. These promises were almost certainly beyond his practical ability to deliver, a fact that some of the Crusades' leaders recognized and others chose not to examine too carefully. The historian Jonathan Phillips, in his study of the Fourth Crusade, traces the complex process by which different factions within the crusading leadership evaluated the Alexios proposal and reached different conclusions, with the outcome shaped more by the accumulated pressure of debt and necessity than by any single decision or deliberate plan. Innocent III opposed the diversion to Constantinople as clearly as he had opposed Zara. His letters were explicit. The crusade was to proceed to the Holy Land. The crusade went to Constantinople anyway. The fleet arrived outside the city in late June of 1203. The walls of Constantinople were among the most formidable defensive structures in the medieval world. The army outside them was not large enough, by any conventional military calculation, to take the city by storm. What the army had was the legitimate claimant, young Alexios, whose presence was supposed to trigger a popular uprising against the usurper. The uprising did not materialize with the force or speed that the Crusaders had anticipated. A Venetian naval assault on the seawall in July succeeded in breaching it at several points. The usurping emperor fled. Isaac was restored to the throne, and his son was crowned co-emperor as Alexios IV. The Crusaders camped outside the city and waited for the payment of the promises that had brought them there. The payment did not come in the amounts promised. The reunification of the churches proved politically impossible. The Byzantine population, watching their emperor strip sacred objects from churches to raise money owed to the Western army, grew increasingly hostile to both the new co-emperor and his foreign supporters. In January of 1204, a political revolt deposed and killed Alexios IV and installed a new emperor who had no intention of honoring the previous emperor's promises. The Crusaders were now outside Constantinople with no prospect of payment and no obvious path to their original destination. They had been gone from home for nearly 2 years. The political logic of their situation, shaped by debt, by contracts signed with Venice, and by the absence of any other available course of action, pointed in one direction. They would take Constantinople for themselves. The assault of April 1204 breached the sea wall again. This time, there was no political solution waiting on the other side. The city was taken, and Niketas Choniates, watching from inside, recorded what followed with the precision of a man who understood that he was witnessing something that would not be undone. Libraries burned, manuscripts that had survived the fall of Rome, the Persian invasions, and centuries of other conflicts were destroyed in days. Sacred objects that had been venerated for 8 centuries were melted down for their metal content. The historian David Nicol describes the sack of Constantinople as one of the most consequential acts of cultural destruction in medieval history. Not primarily because of immediate casualties, but because of the systematic loss of an irreplaceable heritage that no subsequent recovery could restore. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople and divided the former Byzantine territories among themselves and their Venetian partners. The Latin Empire lasted until 1261, when Byzantine forces retook Constantinople, but many historians argue that the restoration could not undo the structural damage. The Byzantines who returned found a city diminished in population, stripped of much of its wealth, and weakened in ways that would make the confrontation with rising Ottoman power in the following centuries more dangerous than it might otherwise have been. For the history of the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade is the most powerful single piece of evidence that political and economic interests operated beneath and alongside the religious framing of the crusading movement. A military expedition launched under papal authority, blessed with spiritual rewards for participants, and aimed at the recovery of Jerusalem, had instead been excommunicated twice by the Pope who launched it and had not engaged a single Muslim army. The historian Thomas Madden, who is among the most careful and fair-minded scholars of the Fourth Crusade, resists the conclusion that this outcome demonstrates the crusading ideal was simply a mask for territorial ambition. He argues, with considerable textual support, that the leaders of the Fourth Crusade genuinely believed at each stage that they were making decisions consistent with the crusading vow. That argument is probably correct as a description of individual psychology, but it does not settle the larger question: whether or not individual leaders were cynically manipulating religious language for material ends. The structural reality was that the crusading framework consistently created conditions in which economic interests and political opportunities could redirect expeditions from their stated purposes while maintaining the vocabulary of holy war. The religious framing was not false in the sense of being deliberately deceptive, but it was flexible in ways that served the powerful more consistently than the holy. That flexibility was about to be demonstrated again, in ways that made the attack on Constantinople look almost coherent by comparison. Chapter 9. The Strange Crusades. Heretics, Emperors, and Political Enemies. By the early 13th century, the crusading idea had expanded so far beyond its original context that it was being applied to enemies who had nothing to do with the Holy Land, and in some cases, had nothing to do with Islam. The institution that Urban II had created to direct Christian military energy toward Jerusalem was now a general-purpose instrument of papal power that could be pointed at almost anyone the Church defined as an enemy. The story of how that happened is, in its way, the most revealing chapter in the entire history of the Crusades. Because when you see the crusading apparatus deployed against European Christians, the political machinery beneath the religious language becomes impossible to ignore. 3 separate episodes in this chapter, each different in geography and circumstance, each pointing toward the same conclusion. By the early 13th century, crusade had become a word that could justify almost any use of violence that the institutional church chose to bless. And the gap between the word and the holy war Urban had originally intended had never been wider. The Albigensian Crusade of 1209 to 1229 was launched against the Cathar population of southern France, a religious movement that, as historians describe their beliefs, held a dualist theology, viewing the material world as the creation of an evil god and the spiritual world as the domain of the good God. They rejected Catholic sacraments, the authority of the Pope, and much of the institutional structure of the medieval church. The Cathar movement had attracted significant popular support in the Languedoc, including the tolerance or active sympathy of local nobles like Raymond VI of Toulouse, who found the Cathars' critique of clerical corruption appealing and their presence politically useful as a counterweight to papal authority. Pope Innocent III had spent years attempting to address the problem through preaching and persuasion. When a papal legate named Peter of Castelnau was murdered in January of 1208, almost certainly by a knight in Raymond's service, Innocent had the justification he needed for a more drastic response. He called a crusade. He offered the same spiritual rewards to those who fought the Cathars in southern France that had been offered to those who fought Muslims in the Holy Land. A theological equivalence that itself reveals how far the crusading framework had traveled from its origins. He declared that the lands of those who supported heresy were available for seizure by whoever conquered them, and he found an eager instrument in Simon de Montfort, a French noble from the north, whose combination of military capability and ideological conviction made him the effective commander of a campaign that was simultaneously a religious persecution and a conquest of one part of France by another. The Albigensian Crusade lasted, in various forms, for 2 decades. It killed tens of thousands of people. It destroyed the distinctive culture of the Languedoc, one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan regions of medieval Europe, with a tradition of poetry, religious diversity, and commercial openness that distinguished it sharply from the more rigid, feudal culture of the French North. The political outcome of the campaign was the steady absorption of the Languedoc into the French royal domain, a process that the Crusade facilitated by destroying the independence of the southern nobility. God's work and French royal expansion had proven, once again, to be remarkably compatible. The second episode is the one most often misrepresented in popular culture. The events of 1212, known as the Children's Crusade, are frequently described as armies of innocent children marching toward the Holy Land and being sold into slavery. The historical reality, as the scholar Gary Dixon reconstructed it in his careful analysis, is more complicated and considerably more ambiguous than the legend suggests. What Dixon's analysis indicates is that the events of 1212 involved not primarily children in the modern sense, but rather what medieval sources called pueri, a term that could mean young people but more broadly referred to the poor, the humble, and the socially marginal. The movements of 1212 appear to have been popular religious revivals led by charismatic preachers, one in France associated with a figure named Stephen of Cloyes, and one in the Rhineland associated with Nicholas of Cologne, that generated large gatherings of poor people who believed that God would open a path for them to reach Jerusalem. The French movement reportedly reached Marseille, where the sea declined to part and the marchers dispersed. The German movement crossed the Alps, suffering significant attrition in the mountain passes, and reached Italian cities where the gatherings eventually dissolved. The events of 1212 did not produce a military campaign. The legend that grew from them tells us more about the needs of the centuries that embellished it than about the actual events. But even in its historically accurate form, the episode illuminates the persistent gap between the crusading ideal as experienced by the institutional church and the crusading impulse as felt by ordinary people who had no institutional access, but who took the promises of spiritual reward as seriously as any bishop. The most intellectually striking of the strange crusades was not a military failure, but a diplomatic success that the church found deeply embarrassing. The expedition led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II recovered Jerusalem for Christian control through negotiation rather than combat. The Pope responded by denouncing it. Frederick II was one of the most genuinely extraordinary figures of the medieval period. A man who spoke 6 languages, conducted scientific experiments, wrote a treatise on falconry that remained a standard reference for centuries, and maintained a court famous across the Mediterranean world for its cultural and intellectual sophistication. He had also been excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX before he even embarked on the crusade. The culmination of years of conflict over Frederick's failure to depart on a crusade he had vowed to lead and his generally independent attitude toward papal authority, Frederick departed on crusade while still under excommunication, a situation without precedent. He arrived in the Holy Land in 1228 with a smaller army than expected, because many crusaders were reluctant to serve under an excommunicated emperor, and he immediately began direct diplomatic negotiations with the Egyptian Sultan al-Kamil. The negotiations were complex, and the sources record that some of the military orders in the Holy Land, whose cooperation should have been guaranteed, were actively working against Frederick's mission, communicating with Sultan al-Kamil in ways that were intended to undermine the negotiations. It is one of the more remarkable episodes of internal Crusader division in the entire era. The treaty Frederick achieved in 1229 recovered Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast for Christian control, on terms that included a 10-year truce and provisions allowing Muslim worship to continue at the Temple Mount. Frederick entered Jerusalem and crowned himself king in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in a ceremony that no priest would perform because of the excommunication. So he performed it himself. Pope Gregory IX's response was to declare the treaty an outrage and to invade Frederick's Italian territories while Frederick was away. The Patriarch of Jerusalem placed the city under interdict, meaning that the church's most sacred services could not be performed there, on the grounds that Frederick's presence made the city spiritually problematic. The local military orders refused to cooperate with Frederick's military operations. The historian David Abulafia, in his biography of Frederick II, describes this episode as one of the most revealing moments in the history of the relationship between the crusading ideal and institutional church politics. A Christian emperor had recovered Jerusalem without major bloodshed, through a combination of diplomatic skill and genuine understanding of the Muslim world he was negotiating with. The church condemned him for it, not because the outcome was bad for Christianity, but because the process had been conducted outside papal authority and in defiance of papal wishes. The treaty's terms were, from a purely practical standpoint, more favorable to Christian interests than anything that had been achieved by force since the First Crusade. It did not matter. The institutional logic of the papacy required that crusades be papal instruments. A successful crusade conducted by an excommunicated emperor was, from that institutional perspective, worse than a failed crusade conducted under proper authority, because it demonstrated that papal authority was not necessary for the achievement of crusading goals. Frederick left the Holy Land in 1229. Jerusalem remained in Christian hands until 1244, when the Khwarezmian Turks retook it in a campaign that made the loss permanent. Frederick's 10 years of peace turned out to be the last period of Christian political control over Jerusalem that the medieval world would see. Hold these three episodes together, and the pattern becomes clear. A crusade against French Christians that expanded French royal territory. A popular movement of poor people that the church neither planned nor could control. A diplomatic recovery of Jerusalem that the church condemned because it was conducted on the wrong terms. By the middle of the 13th century, the crusading framework had become so flexible that it could bless conquest within France, validate popular religious movements with no military capacity, and simultaneously condemn a successful diplomatic recovery of the city it claimed to exist for. When a word can mean almost anything, it is beginning to mean nothing. The crusading idea was not yet exhausted, but the first signs of that exhaustion were visible to anyone paying careful attention. Chapter 10. The Final Campaigns and the Fall of Acre. In the spring of 1244, a force of Khwarezmian Turks, displaced from their Central Asian homeland by advancing Mongol armies, and operating as mercenaries for the Egyptian Sultan, swept through Jerusalem and ended the Christian occupation of the city that Frederick II's diplomacy had secured 15 years earlier. The loss was extensive. The Christian population that had returned during the period of the treaty was largely expelled. Jerusalem would not be under Christian political control again until 1917, when British forces entered the city during the First World War. Walking, rather than riding in recognition of the city's sacred status, the loss of 1244 was, in retrospect, permanent, but it was not understood as permanent by the people who lived through it. For the Christian world of the mid-13th century, another catastrophe demanded another crusade. The man who answered the call was Louis IX of France, known to history as St. Louis, and his two crusading expeditions represent, in their combination of genuine personal holiness and strategic disaster, perhaps the most concentrated expression of the contradiction at the heart of the entire crusading movement. Louis was, by the testimony of contemporaries and by the assessment of modern historians including Jean Richard and William Chester Jordan, a man of extraordinary personal piety and moral seriousness. He fasted regularly, attended multiple church services daily, personally cared for the sick and the poor in ways that went well beyond ceremonial charity, and regarded the recovery of Jerusalem not as a political project, but as a personal obligation to God. His motivations were as purely religious as those of any crusading leader in the movement's entire history. He was also, as a military strategist and logistical planner, operating in the complex political environment of the 13th century Middle East, consistently overmatched by the problems he faced. The Seventh Crusade of 1248 to 1254 followed the strategic logic that had been established for the Fourth Crusade. Egypt was the key. Take Damietta at the mouth of the Nile, use it as a base for operations against Cairo, and leverage control of Egypt to negotiate the return of Jerusalem. Louis assembled the largest and best-equipped crusading force since the Third Crusade, spending years in meticulous preparation and stockpiling supplies on Cyprus before the expedition departed. He landed at Damietta in June of 1249 and took the city almost without resistance, a success so rapid that it generated dangerous overconfidence about what the rest of the campaign would require. The advance toward Cairo that followed in the winter of 1249 to 1250 demonstrated the degree to which the Egyptian environment defeated military planning that had not fully accounted for it. The Nile Delta in winter is a landscape of canals, marshes, and floodplains that restrict movement to specific routes and make supply lines enormously vulnerable. The Ayyubid forces defending Egypt used those geographic constraints with practiced skill, blocking the crusading advance at a canal crossing near Mansoura. In February of 1250, Louis's brother Robert of Artois led a cavalry charge that broke through the initial Egyptian defense and penetrated into the town of Mansoura itself. The Templars, who accompanied the charge, urged withdrawal to consolidate the position. Robert refused and pressed deeper into the streets, where narrow alleys and dense buildings negated the cavalry's advantages and allowed Egyptian forces, led by the Mamluk commander Baybars, to surround and destroy the French vanguard. Robert of Artois was killed. The Templars lost the majority of their force. The main crusading army held its position, but could not advance. Disease moved through the camp with the efficiency it always displayed in the Delta environment. Supply lines were cut by Egyptian river forces. By April of 1250, the situation had become untenable, and Louis ordered a retreat toward Damietta that collapsed into a rout. The king himself was captured, seriously ill, and the bulk of his army was killed or taken prisoner. The negotiations for Louis's release produced a substantial ransom and the surrender of Damietta. Louis paid, was released, and instead of returning to France, traveled to the remnant Crusader states in the Levant, where he spent 4 years strengthening the fortifications of the coastal cities. He returned to France in 1254, having recovered nothing of what the Crusade had set out to achieve. Louis spent the following 15 years governing his kingdom and planning a second crusade. He departed in 1270, choosing Tunis as the initial target in a strategic reasoning that has puzzled historians ever since. He died at Tunis in August of 1270, almost certainly of illness, before the campaign had accomplished anything. He was 55 years old. He was canonized as a saint in 1297 by Pope Boniface VIII. His 2 crusades had cost France enormous resources, had failed completely in their stated objectives, and had been conducted by a man whose personal holiness was beyond serious dispute. The gap between the sincerity of the commitment and the futility of the result was, by 1270, becoming impossible to ignore. The political landscape that Louis had been operating within was, during this same period, being transformed by a force that no one in the crusading tradition had fully prepared for: the Mongol Empire, which had emerged from the Central Asian steppes under Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, reached the Middle East in the 1250s under the leadership of Hulagu Khan. In 1258, Hulagu's forces took Baghdad, killed the Abbasid Caliph, and effectively ended the Abbasid Caliphate that had been the symbolic center of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries. The destruction of Baghdad was one of the most catastrophic single events in the history of Islamic civilization. For the Crusader states, the Mongol advance presented a strategic situation of extraordinary complexity. The Mongol Empire was not a Muslim power. Hulagu's own wife was a Nestorian Christian. There were diplomatic contacts between Mongol and European powers, exploring the possibility of a coordinated alliance against the Muslim powers between them. The historian Peter Jackson, in his study of the Mongols in the West, documents the sustained European diplomatic engagement with the Mongols and the consistent failure to translate that engagement into effective military coordination. Communications were slow, conducted through intermediaries, and consistently plagued by mutual incomprehension of political systems that had nothing in common. The decisive moment came in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut in northern Palestine, where a Mamluk army from Egypt confronted a Mongol force in an engagement whose strategic consequences, while debated in some of their details by modern scholars, resulted in the Mongol forces withdrawing from the Levant and never returning in comparable strength. The Crusader states had allowed the Mamluk army to pass through their territory without interference, a decision that reflected their assessment that the Mamluks were a more manageable neighbor than the Mongols, whose ambitions were more difficult to predict. The historian Reuven Amitai Price, in his study of the Mongols and the Mamluks, notes that this was probably the rational choice given the information available at the time. But the long-term consequence was that the power now dominating the Middle East was the Mamluks, who had no interest in accommodation with the Crusader presence and every interest in its elimination. The Mamluk Sultanate that emerged from this period was one of the most formidable military states in the medieval world. The Sultan Baybars, who came to power in 1260, was the man who would begin the systematic reduction of the Crusader states. His approach was methodical and deliberate. He conducted a sustained series of military operations that captured one Crusader fortification after another, disrupted the agricultural hinterland that fed the coastal cities, and systematically reduced the territory and resources available to the defenders. Caesarea fell in 1265. Arsuf fell in 1265. Safed fell in 1266. Jaffa fell in 1268. Antioch fell in 1268. The fall of Antioch deserves particular attention because of its symbolic weight. Antioch had been one of the 4 original Crusader states. Established after the First Crusade, it had held against Muslim armies for nearly 2 centuries. Baybars took it in less than 4 days. He sent a letter to the absent Crusader prince describing what had happened to his city in terms designed to convey the totality of the destruction. The letter survives and is one of the most striking documents of the entire crusading era, revealing the deliberate psychological dimension of Baybars's military strategy. The response from Europe produced Louis's fatal campaign in Tunis and Edward of England's limited intervention in 1271 to 1272. Neither produced significant military results. By the 1280s, the Crusader states had been reduced to a handful of coastal cities and castles. The civilian population that had given OUTREMER its social and economic substance had been steadily leaving for decades, recognizing that the situation was not going to improve. The end came at Acre, the last major city of the Crusader states. In the spring of 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil assembled a force whose precise size is difficult to establish from the sources available, but was clearly overwhelming relative to the defenders. The garrison of Acre numbered perhaps 14,000 soldiers, supplemented by whatever the military orders and civilian population could contribute. The siege began in April of 1291. The defenders fought with a ferocity that the sources on both sides acknowledge. The military orders conducted sorties that temporarily disrupted the siege works. Individual acts of courage were recorded by chroniclers who understood that they were witnessing the final chapter of something that had lasted nearly 2 centuries. The walls were breached on May 18th. The fighting in the streets was intense and continued for hours after the initial breach. The Templar headquarters, a massive fortified compound near the harbor, held out for 10 more days after the rest of the city had fallen, until the walls were undermined and the last organized resistance ended. The survivors who could reach the harbor escaped by sea. The city that had been the commercial and administrative capital of the Crusader states for a century was systematically demolished by the Mamluks, who wanted to ensure it could not serve as a base for future operations. The remaining Crusader positions on the coast surrendered or were abandoned within weeks. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, which had lasted from the fall of Jerusalem in 1099 to the fall of Acre in 1291, was over. It had endured for 192 years. It had required continuous military and financial investment from Europe throughout its existence and had never achieved the self-sustaining stability that would have allowed it to survive without that investment. The historian Jonathan Riley Smith, reflecting on the fall of Acre, resists the teleological view that the Crusader states were doomed from their founding by the impossibility of their position. He argues that different political decisions at specific moments might have produced different outcomes. That argument is worth taking seriously. History is not a predetermined script, but the structural facts remain. A small ruling class, dependent on external support, governing a majority population with no strong reason to defend the system, surrounded by powers with deeper roots in the land and greater demographic resources, was always going to face a sustainability problem that brilliant tactics and individual heroism could postpone but not permanently resolve. The last ship had left the harbor. The last castle had fallen. The age of the Crusader states was over. but the idea that had created them, the idea of holy war, of sacred obligation, of a God who called his people to fight, was about to enter a new and in some ways more consequential phase of its history, not in the deserts of the Levant, but in the political languages of the modern world. Chapter 11. The Long Shadow: How the Crusades Shaped the Modern World. Picture a scholar in Cairo in the year 1400. He is writing a history of the wars against the Franks, the Western Christians who had occupied the coastal lands of the Levant for 2 centuries before being driven out. His account is careful, detailed, and largely dispassionate. The Franks are a historical episode, significant, but concluded. They came, they built their strange kingdoms. They were eventually expelled. The Islamic world survived and in many ways flourished. There are more urgent threats in the world of 1400, namely the Mongol successor states and the rising Ottoman power to the west, than the memory of men who left more than a century ago. That scholar's relationship to the Crusades is one that many modern readers find surprising, because it is so different from the way the Crusades function in the political imagination of the Arab world today. The transformation of the Crusades from a concluded historical episode into a living political wound is itself one of the most important stories in modern history. And understanding it requires understanding something that almost never appears in Western accounts of the crusading era. For roughly 3 centuries after the fall of Acre, the Crusades were not a major preoccupation of the Islamic world's historical memory. The Muslim historians and theologians of the 14th and 15th centuries did not treat the Crusades as the defining trauma of Islamic civilization. The Crusades were a significant episode, certainly, but they were one episode among many in a history that included the far more devastating Mongol destruction of Baghdad and the ongoing struggles between different Muslim dynasties. The historian Carol Hillenbrand, in her foundational study titled The Crusades: Islamic Perspectives, documents this pattern of relative historical silence and argues that it reflects the degree to which the Crusades, while traumatic in specific localities and specific periods, did not fundamentally alter the trajectory of Islamic civilization in the way that the Mongol invasions did. The rediscovery of the Crusades as a central reference point in Islamic political thought came primarily in the 19th century. In the context of European colonial expansion into the Arab world, as European powers established influence and eventually direct control over Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Syria, Palestine, and other territories that had been part of the Islamic world for centuries, Arab intellectuals and political leaders reached back into history for a framework that could help explain and contextualize what was happening to them. The Crusades provided that framework. Here, in the medieval past, was a previous episode of European military expansion into the Arab and Islamic heartland, the figure of Saladin, who had been remembered primarily as a political leader and only secondarily as a holy warrior, was reconstructed and amplified into a symbol of successful resistance to Western encroachment. Arab nationalist writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries drew explicit parallels between the medieval Crusaders and the modern European colonial powers, and that parallel proved both politically powerful and historically durable. This documentary does not attempt to explain the modern conflict through the Crusades alone, but to show how historical memory adds symbolic weight to later conflicts, and how the language and imagery of the medieval holy wars became available for political purposes that the knights who carried them would not have recognized. Whether the parallel between medieval crusading and modern colonialism is historically precise in every detail is a question scholars continue to debate. What the historical record does show is that the parallel became politically real, and that its political reality had consequences that shaped the 20th century and continue to shape the present. The Western relationship to the Crusades runs in a very different direction. In the United States and much of Western Europe, the Crusades entered modern political discourse primarily as a metaphor for righteous commitment in the service of a cause believed to be just. President Eisenhower titled his memoir of the Second World War Crusade in Europe, using the word as a straightforward expression of noble purpose in the specific context of a conflict against fascism that his audience understood in clearly moral terms. The word, in that American cultural context, carried no problematic resonance because the Western historical relationship to the medieval Crusades was essentially distant and largely positive in its cultural associations. The collision between these two very different relationships to the same word became apparent in September of 2001. When President George W. Bush used the word crusade in a public statement about the military response he was planning after the attacks of that month, the word was used once, apparently without full awareness of its resonance in the Islamic world, and was quickly walked back by administration officials. The historian Thomas Madden, writing in the immediate aftermath, observed that the Crusades had become a word that meant entirely different things to the American and Arab audiences who heard it simultaneously, and that this asymmetry of historical memory was itself a political problem of genuine consequence. The contrast with Eisenhower's use half a century earlier illustrates how dramatically the word's resonance had changed as the political relationship between the Western world and the Islamic world had changed around it. The military orders that the Crusades had created did not disappear with the fall of Acre. They transformed in ways that illustrate how crusading institutions adapted to survive the loss of their original purpose. The Knights Hospitaller, after the fall of Acre, established themselves first on Cyprus and then on the island of Rhodes, which they held for over 2 centuries as an independent maritime power. When the Ottomans expelled them from Rhodes in 1522, they eventually settled on Malta. In their modern form, the Knights of Malta still exist as an international humanitarian organization with observer status at the United Nations, conducting medical and relief work in conflict zones around the world. The institution that Urban II's call to holy war helped create is still operating, in completely transformed purpose. More than 8 centuries later, the financial dimension of the Templar legacy connects the Crusades to a genuine development in the history of Western economic institutions. The Templars had, out of the practical necessity of managing assets across the enormous distances between their European properties and their Levantine operations, developed instruments of transferable credit that allowed travelers to deposit money in one location and receive equivalent funds in another. The historian Julian Loiseau describes this as one of the early institutional experiments in long-distance financial instruments in the medieval Western world, a meaningful step in the longer chain of development that would, over subsequent centuries, contribute to the financial innovations of the Italian banking families and eventually to the credit systems of the early modern period. The connection is not a direct line of institutional descent, but it represents a real contribution to a tradition of practice that mattered for the development of Western commerce. The commercial consequences of the Crusades extended well beyond the military orders. 2 centuries of crusading activity dramatically accelerated the integration of European markets with the luxury goods and spice trades of the Islamic world. The Italian city-states that had provided naval support for the Crusades in exchange for commercial privileges built trading networks during the crusading era that made the Mediterranean a more intensively connected commercial space than it had been for centuries. When the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 disrupted the established channels through which this trade moved, the pressure to find alternative routes to the east was one of several factors that drove the European exploration of the Atlantic in the late 15th century. The historian William McNeill drew a connection between the commercial appetites stimulated by the Crusades, the disruption of established trade routes by Ottoman expansion, and the exploratory voyages that led to the European encounter with the Americas. That connection is one element in a much larger story. And later historians have qualified McNeill's broader argument in important ways. But the general pattern is supported by enough evidence to take seriously. The cultural consequences of the Crusades were extensive and complex in ways that simplified narratives of clash and conflict obscure. 2 centuries of contact between Western European and Eastern Mediterranean civilizations produced genuine cultural exchange alongside the violence and exploitation. Medical knowledge from the Islamic world entered European practice through the networks of contact that the Crusades created and sustained. Mathematical and scientific texts that had been preserved and developed in the Islamic scholarly tradition became accessible to European scholars, partly through channels that the crusading presence opened. The word crusade itself is perhaps the most durable and most politically complicated legacy of all. In its modern usage, it has become a general-purpose metaphor for any committed effort in the service of a cause believed to be righteous. We speak of crusades against disease, crusades for justice, crusades for reform, using the word to signal moral seriousness, without necessarily invoking anything specific about medieval holy war. But the word does not travel neutrally into every context. In the parts of the world where the historical memory of the Crusades is not a distant medieval episode, but a living reference point for understanding the relationship between Western power and Islamic societies, the use of that word carries implications that the speaker may not intend and the listener cannot ignore. The last Crusader castle fell more than 700 years ago. The conversation that the Crusades started has not ended. And to understand where that conversation came from and why it still generates the heat that it generates, you have to hold the full story in your mind, not the simplified version that either side of the modern debate tends to offer. That is what the final chapter of this documentary is about. Chapter 12. The Verdict. Holy War Conquest or Colonial Project. We have followed this story from a field in France in 1095 to a harbor in Acre in 1291, and from there into the political speeches and historical arguments of the present day. It is time to answer the question that opened this documentary, or more precisely, it is time to explain why the most honest answer is not the one that either side of the modern debate wants to hear. The spine question asked whether the Crusades were a religious mission, a war of conquest, or an early form of colonial expansion. Those 3 options were not presented as mutually exclusive. They were presented as competing frameworks, each of which captures something real, and each of which, applied exclusively, distorts the picture in ways that serve particular interests rather than historical understanding. Begin with what the evidence actually supports. The religious motivation of the Crusades was real. This is the point that the historian Jonathan Riley Smith spent much of his career establishing against a historiographical tradition that had, in his view, systematically underestimated the sincerity of crusading piety. The men and women who sold their lands, left their families, and walked thousands of miles toward a city most of them would never reach, were not primarily motivated by the prospect of material gain. The evidence of crusading wills, crusading correspondence, and the demographic reality that most crusaders returned home poorer than they had left supports the conclusion that genuine religious conviction was a primary motivation for a large proportion of crusade participants. Riley Smith's scholarship established this point with a rigor that made it difficult to dismiss. The secular modern mind, trained by centuries of critique of institutional religion, sometimes finds it easier to believe that medieval people were manipulated by cynical elites than to believe that they acted from convictions that were, by their own lights, entirely rational responses to the theological world they inhabited. Riley Smith's insistence that we take medieval religious experience on its own terms, rather than reducing it to a cover for baser motivations, represents genuine scholarly discipline. But acknowledging the reality of religious motivation does not settle the question of what the Crusades were: sincere faith and political calculation, sincere faith and economic interest, sincere faith and the systematic exploitation of subject populations are not mutually exclusive. The history we have traced demonstrates that they coexisted continuously, in the same institutions, in the same individuals, in the same decisions. The political dimension is equally well documented and equally undeniable. Urban II's call at CLERMONT was shaped by the specific political crisis of the papacy in 1095, by the need to demonstrate papal authority against the Holy Roman Emperor, by the opportunity to address the breach with Constantinople, and by the desire to redirect the violent energy of the knightly class in ways that would benefit the institutional church. The political context was as present and as influential as the theological framework, and the two were inseparable from each other from the very beginning. The colonial question is the most contested and requires the most careful handling, because it involves applying an analytical category developed in a different historical period to a context in which that category did not exist. The historian Ronnie Ellenblum challenged the picture of complete separation between crusader rulers and subject populations, finding evidence of more complex patterns of interaction. The historian Jeremy Johns has documented specific instances of administrative cooperation and cultural exchange that complicate any simple model. These challenges are legitimate, and they matter. But the basic structural features that the historian Joshua Proer identified remain defensible. The Crusader states contained structural features that later historians can meaningfully compare to forms of colonial expansion: a foreign elite, defined by religion and geographic origin, established political and military control over a majority population through conquest. That elite reserved political rights, legal advantages, and access to the best land for itself. The majority population was required to provide labor and tribute that sustained the ruling class while receiving subordinate legal status in return. Those structural features were real, and they shaped every dimension of life in OUTREMER. The historian Christopher Tyerman, in his comprehensive history of the Crusades, stakes out a middle position that most contemporary scholars find more defensible than either the purely religious or the purely colonial reading. Tyerman describes the Crusades as a genuinely novel institution that combined elements of pilgrimage, warfare, and colonial settlement in proportions that varied across time, geography, and individual motivation. And that cannot be reduced to any single explanatory category without losing the complexity that makes them historically interesting. That is probably the most defensible scholarly position. It is also, in a specific way, unsatisfying for those seeking a clean verdict. because it resists the kind of simple answer that partisan arguments on both sides of the modern debate are looking for. And that resistance is itself instructive. The Crusades are still contested precisely because they sit at the intersection of questions that the modern world has not resolved. Questions about the relationship between religion and violence. Questions about when political and economic interests are genuinely served by religious conviction and when they merely use it. Questions about who has the right to be where, and on what terms, and decided by whom. The historians who have contributed most to our understanding of the Crusades, Jonathan Riley Smith and Christopher Tyerman and Thomas Asbridge and Jonathan Phillips and the many others whose work has been cited throughout this documentary, do not agree on every question. They disagree on the relative weight of religious and political motivations. They disagree on how to evaluate the Crusader states as political and social entities. They disagree on the long-term consequences of the crusading era. What they agree on, almost universally, is that simple answers to the questions the Crusades raise are almost certainly wrong. The Crusades were a religious mission. The faith was real. The sacrifice was real. And the theological framework that made holy war comprehensible to its participants was a genuine and coherent system of belief rather than a cynical manipulation. The Crusades were a war of conquest. They killed large numbers of people, displaced existing populations, and established political structures designed to maintain the privilege of a conquering minority over a subject majority through force and law. The Crusader states contained structural features that later historians can meaningfully compare to forms of colonial expansion, even if the specific institutional forms and ideological frameworks of 19th century European colonialism did not yet exist. These three things are not contradictions. They are facets of a single complex phenomenon, seen from different angles, each angle revealing something real that the others cannot fully capture. Why does it still matter? The answer is partly about identity. For Catholic and broader Christian communities, the Crusades are an episode that requires honest moral reckoning, an acknowledgement that institutions acting in the name of Christ committed acts that are difficult to reconcile with the values that Christianity claims as its foundation. Pope John Paul II acknowledged this explicitly in the Day of Pardon ceremony in March of the year 2000. Expressing sorrow for the sins committed by members of the Church in the service of the crusading ideal. That acknowledgement was important and was also, by itself, insufficient as a complete reckoning with an episode of that complexity and consequence. For Muslim communities, particularly those in the Arab world, whose political experience of the 20th century included European colonial domination of territories that had been part of the Islamic world for centuries, the Crusades are not primarily a medieval episode. They are a framework for understanding a pattern of Western military and political involvement in the Islamic world that many people in those communities experience as ongoing. Whether that understanding is historically precise in every detail or not, it is politically real, and its political reality has consequences that cannot be resolved simply by insisting on historical complexity. For Western secular audiences, the Crusades offer a mirror in which the relationship between stated values and actual behavior can be examined without the emotional defenses that contemporary politics generates. The crusading leaders who genuinely believed they were doing God's work while simultaneously advancing their own political and territorial interests are not figures from an alien moral universe. The gap between what we say we are doing and what we are actually doing is not a medieval pathology. It is a permanent feature of political life that the Crusades illuminate with unusual clarity precisely because enough time has passed that we can see the gap without the ideological fog that the present always produces. The knight from Normandy, kneeling on stones darkened with blood, outside Jerusalem in 1099 believed, with absolute sincerity, that he was in the presence of God. He was also participating in an act of mass violence. He was also the instrument of a political project that served the interests of a pope in crisis and the ambitions of nobles looking for land and glory. He was also a pilgrim, finally arrived at the city he had been walking toward for 2 years, weeping with a relief and a wonder that no political analysis can fully contain. All of those things were true simultaneously. The Crusades were all of those things simultaneously. That is what makes them so difficult to think about clearly. And that is precisely why thinking about them clearly still matters. The wound referenced in this documentary's title is real. It is not primarily a wound in stone or in territory. It is a wound in the way different parts of the world remember and understand a shared history, in the degree to which that memory continues to shape the political imagination of the present, and in the distance that still exists between different communities who experience the same events from irreconcilably different positions. The last Crusader castle fell more than 700 years ago. The conversation that the Crusades started is still going, in forms that the knight from Normandy would not have recognized, but that carry, in their structure and their urgency, something of the same collision of faith and power and fear and ambition that set him on the road in the first place. That conversation belongs to all of us now, and understanding where it came from is the first step toward having it more honestly than we have managed so far.